That he was going to need to change the SOP for the pre-tape.
Hi, everybody. It's Joe Cioffi. Joe Rayo is going to join me in 1 second as we. Hi, everybody. It's Joe. As I take care of fixing the audio first. Welcome this evening. Of course, with everything that's going on, we have two major hurricanes to talk about tonight, and this is a very we have a history-making storm, and both myself and Joe Rayo, who now comes into the frame.
Yes. Hello there.
We, both of us have been around. We've got about 80 years of weather experience between us, and your hair's a little wider than mine.
Yes.
But it's hard for me to really recall something like this where we have, well, certainly the fact that we have a Category 5 hurricane with Irma that is now the longest-lasting Category 5 hurricane on record, and it's still going. And who knows whether it'll just be a Category 5 all the way through the Bahamas.
It's quite possible. I mentioned last night that the GFS, which has probably the best of the global models in terms of forecasting intensity, still has that storm somewhere around 900 millibars on Sunday morning as it's closing in on Miami in South Florida. And if you go by the criteria for the Saffir-Simpson scale, a 900 millibar storm or hurricane would be a Category 5. Of course, there are other things to take into consideration, the water temperatures, and of course, whether or not there's any local wind shear that may cut into the strength of the storm. But regardless of whether or not it's a Category 5 or even a very strong Category 4, when it arrives at the South Florida coast on Sunday morning, it is going to be a devastating storm for the folks all across, especially the eastern part of Florida, although we've been going back and forth about whether or not it's either going to go up the east coast or maybe up the spine, so to speak, of central Florida. But it looks like, Joe, a perfect storm if you're looking for catastrophic or widespread devastating damage.
Right, and the track up, I was been talking about this for a couple of days. A track up along or just west of I-95, basically, is probably a worst-case scenario in a sense that it would produce hurricane winds on both coasts and also in inland areas. I mean, when you look at some of the model guidance, this thing is still a Category 3 or a strong 2 when it makes it up north of Gainesville. And it'll take all day Sunday and Sunday night to go from the western Florida Keys, this is assuming that the Europeans track is correct, all the way up to just north of Gainesville. So all the inland areas are going to experience at least hurricane force gusts, I would imagine.
Right. It's indeed a slow mover. I mean, we're talking about a storm that is probably not going to be moving much more than 10 or 11 or 12 miles an hour as it slowly works its way from south to north. And we're talking Miami, let's say Sunday morning, we may be talking Jacksonville up in the north end of Florida or thereabouts by Monday morning. So you can get the idea. It's going to take the better part of an entire day and night to get it all the way up from south to north across the Florida Peninsula.
The buzzsaw that a Hurricane Irma is, and make no mistake, it is a buzzsaw, is, if you on the loop right now, two things that stand out to me. One is, first of all, we've got actually three things. Perfectly circular eye. And it really hasn't changed very much at all. After moving through the northern leewards and north of Puerto Rico, the structure of the core of this hurricane seems to remain completely intact. The other thing is, if you look closely, these are the Turks and Caicos Islands in the southeast Bahamas. And you've got a couple of very small islands that are out there, not too far from the bigger islands to the north. The eye right now is sitting right over this tiny little island. I'm not sure what the name of that island is, but it is sitting right over there, and Turks and Caicos right now inside the eye wall of Hurricane Irma. And I'm going to be curious to see what the recon finds, because it's the pressure's come up a little bit from today, but not much. And I'm wondering whether it may have strengthened a little bit because of the slightly more circular look.
Yeah, it's indeed, as I said yesterday, the storm Irma has been living a charmed life. It has managed to if it has to pass over some spit of land, that's exactly what it's been. It's just a very, very small area of land, hardly making a dent in the overall intensity of the storm in terms of wind and in terms of you just pointed out how nearly perfect that eye looks, perfectly circular. It has managed to avoid Hispaniola, which has some very, very tall mountains. And I mentioned last night that, if memory serves me correct, in 1979 we had Hurricanes David and Frederick interact with Hispaniola, and for a time some of the circulation was shredded. But Joe, it doesn't seem like it's going to be interacting with any major area of land until it finally gets to Florida on Sunday morning. And again, the worst case scenario, that thing is going to be, again, the National Hurricane Center officially is saying a Category 4 storm with 130 mile per hour sustained winds, but it could very well be a Category 5 still with 155 mile per hour plus winds. One of the hardest things for a hurricane forecaster to try to deal with is trying to anticipate the strength of these things. Even sometimes as little as 6 or 12 or 24 hours out, these storms tend to either diminish unexpectedly or intensify suddenly, and that's what we're usually looking at with most storms. This thing has been incredible because, as you mentioned, the duration, each hour after hour after hour, still at Category 5, and what has it done? It's lost exactly 10 miles.
In terms of wind speed,
wind speed in the last 24
hours.
And
only a few millibars in pressure. Those islands, by the way, are called Little Ambergans Cay, and the island that is literally next to it is called Big Ambergans Cay. Those are islands that are south of the Turks and Caicos Islands that the eye of Irma is right now right over. And it looks like it may just try to thread that little waterway in between these two island sets. It's just amazing how it seemed finding a way. I'm kind of thinking, too, that the course, was west-northwest, but it looks like it might be a little closer to west right now than west-northwest, just following that eye over the last couple of frames.
Yeah. And, of course, as you can see here, what we're showing you, we're transitioning from the visible satellite to the infrared. That's what that vertical line that's sweeping from right to left across the view happens to be. It's getting down to, but I've always found that when we look at a hurricane, either just at sunrise or at sunset on visible satellite, it looks more dramatic. You can see it looks more three-dimensional. The shadows being cast across the hurricane give it that texture type look. And now as we move into the cover of darkness, we're beginning to see, again with the infrared, that near perfect hurricane shape, the outflow of the storm, the eye. It's just amazing every single day. It continues to amaze longtime weather observers, veterans like ourselves, and I'm sure even the hardened hurricane forecasters down in Florida. And by the way, we were just talking about this a little while ago, the folks at the National Hurricane Center are literally in the crosshairs of this storm.
Yes, they are boarding up the building there.
It's going to be very interesting. While I don't think that, I hope that they don't, have to close down, or if they lose something significant in terms of power, or in terms of just the ability to communicate vital information. We're just wondering who would take over. I would suppose, as hard as this may
maybe the Storm Prediction Center,
or maybe even since they're prepared for tropical activity, maybe out in Honolulu, the Eastern Pacific Hurricane Center that takes care of the storms out in the Pacific.
Let's just touch on a couple of comments, and then we'll go back to do some more graphics. But Jason Mino said, you got his question asked. He was asking about the eye and where the strongest winds usually are with these storms. Maybe you can take that on.
Well, the strongest winds are not found in the middle of the storm, right in the middle of the eye. That, in fact, is where you find the calmest conditions. But if you are located right along the periphery or right along the edge of the eye wall, so to speak, that is where you're going to find the most sustained and strongest winds. And, in fact, when we have recon flights, as we saw yesterday, we were talking about on our last broadcast, we were watching as the Hurricane Hunter was going around the eye wall because that's where, if you're going to look for the strongest winds, that's where the strongest winds happen to be. If you're right in the center of the storm, that is where the calmest winds are. You may remember the movie of The Perfect Storm, where the Andrea Gale was and this was not necessarily a hurricane, but it was a storm with tropical-like characteristics. They were in the eye of the storm, and for a while they were experiencing hardly anything in terms of wind. Interestingly, though, you don't see very much in the way of wind in the center of the eye of the storm, but the waves, if you happen to be,
must be huge.
Oh, if you're on a ship and you're in the eye of the storm, you're getting tossed around like a cork inside of a raging bathtub bottle. So while the winds, in contrast, are hardly anything, the waves being tossed around, the swells inside of that eye are absolutely tremendous.
This is the Hurricane Center's 5 o'clock forecast on their advisory, and you can see the position was at the time was 20.9 north, 71.1 west, so it's a little bit west of there. It's moving along at 16 miles an hour, 175 mile an hour sustained winds, making it as Category 5 and keeping it as a Category 5. The red areas that you see shaded are where all the hurricane warnings are up at the moment. So all of the Bahamas, much of the north coast of Cuba, still having a leftover hurricane warning, still a hurricane warning for the north coast of the Dominican Republic. And we have watches up on both sides of South Florida, from Bonita Beach on the west coast down to the Florida Keys, and then around up northward through Miami up to Jupiter Inlet. And just, speaking of Miami, by the way, we were discussing this in the newsroom today. Miami's a city of cranes. There are a lot of cranes because of the construction that's continually going on there. My understanding is that those cranes can only withstand winds of about 100, only withstand, because you didn't, the odds of picking up a storm that would surpass this, but are built to sustain winds of 140 miles an hour. This comes in, if the eye wall comes in from the southeast into Miami, there's a problem.
Yes.
And the possibilities here are. There are so many in terms of the track, in terms of how it comes in on the coast and how that impacts storm surge and everything else. And those are all really very difficult, if not impossible, questions to ask, because we really, we still don't know exactly where the eye is going to cross. The Hurricane Center has adjusted their track a little bit to the left, or in other words, a little further west, which would bring the hurricane in either as a Category 4 or possibly as a Category 5 hurricane. Right over the western part of the Keys, and then moving sort of straight north up over Lake Okeechobee, probably the center passing near or just east of Orlando, and then making its way toward Jacksonville. But basically it's an inland track, and that's because a lot of the models today shifted to the west.
And the worst, if the storm had stayed, or the eye of the storm, the center of the storm had stayed just offshore by 10 or 15 or 20 miles, that would have actually been better than what we are now looking at, because that now means that places that are right along the shore areas, right along the coast, are going to be possibly within the so-called northeast quadrant of the hurricane, which is the absolute worst part of the storm to be in terms of wind and in terms of precipitation, squally precipitation. And there may also be, as the storm approaches, tornado watches put into effect, because there could very well be in some of those squalls funnel clouds or tornado formation as well. You just mentioned, though, Joe, about the cranes in Miami, and I thought about this, and I posted on my own Facebook page a little while ago. About 30 years ago, when I was more into radio than television, I managed to get an interview, a radio interview, with the then director of the National Hurricane Center. In fact, the longest tenured director still to this day of the Hurricane Center, Dr. Neil Frank. Dr. Frank just recently retired. He was at KHOU in Texas, Houston, Texas. He's 80 years old now, and he just retired from his television career. But when I had that radio interview with him all those years ago in the 1980s, I think it was like 84, 85 or whatever, I'd asked him what was his greatest fear in terms of keeping the general public safe. And he talked about the fact that the coastline, the eastern shoreline of Florida, was just absolutely exploding in terms of development. And he was trying to tell the developers, if you're going to build, try to build away from the shore areas, 200 or 300 or 400 yards away, so at this rate, if there's any kind of storm surge, the water coming in would not immediately impact or would not immediately affect homes that are right down by the water. But his suggestion pretty much fell on deaf ears. That coastline, all the way from Miami up to Jacksonville, is just loaded now with developments that have sprung up over the last 20 and 30 years. And he said his greatest fear was having a storm system that would impact homes right down by the shore areas. And it looks like that's going to be his greatest fear coming our way on Sunday and Monday with the approach of Irma.
Going back to the crane question, Adam Toxin of Tri-State Weather pointed out that apparently the cranes are designed to spin, so the wind.
Well, that's not. If I'm in Miami and I'm looking up,
I don't want to see a spinning crane. Yes, I understand. And there are 12 of them. I just lost who it was, but whoever it was, thank you for giving us the number. Patrick Ritchie, the eye's about what I would say is about 30 or 40 miles wide.
30 or 40 miles wide, yeah.
Which is kind of wide for an intense hurricane. But you may have seen. I don't have it to show, but you might have seen the kind of overlaid the satellite of Irma over Andrew, and in terms of the geographic size of what Irma has now expanded to, Andrew is really dwarfed by it. Andrew was a small hurricane in terms of the geographic size. Irma is much bigger. And by the way, these are the forecast tracks this afternoon. And if you remember from yesterday, they were kind of split. We had some, a lot to the east, a lot to the west. And today they are concentrated. Just about every one of them brings it on land, even into the easternmost part of southeastern Florida. And then we have, of course, a few of them that go a little bit further to the west. If you want to get an idea where the global models had it, the GFS would probably be near the eastern end. But even the GFS late this afternoon has come with an inland, a low that comes inland into South Florida. And the European, this actually might be more like the UK Met. The British model was further the furthest west. The European somewhere in between here. So they're all very, very close.
Very, very tightly clustered. By the way, getting back to Andrew, one thing that Andrew had that this storm does not, Irma. Andrew, if you remember, using the analogy of a buzzsaw, Andrew must have been moving at least 20 or 25 miles per hour, much faster than Irma. And Andrew just cut right straight across the middle of Florida,
and right over Homestead,
right, and right into the Gulf of Mexico and headed for the Gulf Coast. But as I just noted a little while ago, Irma is moving much more slowly, and that may have also contributed to all the devastation with Andrew. Is the forward speed? If you have a very powerful storm with a rapid forward speed, and we saw this with Wilma, actually back. Wilma was what, 2005? Or?
It was and oddly, it was 2005 and a Cat 5 in its life cycle. It holds the record for the lowest pressure, 883, in the Gulf of Mexico. That was the year that was a year that was extremely active. That we went through the whole alphabet, and then we went into the Greek letters too.
And a lot of the devastation, I think, that came out of Wilma was the fact that storm was a very fast-moving storm. So the rapidity of, or the overall speed of a storm also adds to the potential damage. So I'm not saying that because Irma is a slow mover, we're not going to see all that much damage. But and Irma, as you just mentioned, much larger. So one of the websites showed the comparison between the size of Andrew, the width or breadth of Andrew, and you could probably put almost two Andrews inside of Irma.
Sure. I think with respect to the weather models, we're at the point now, being that it is now Thursday night, and we're talking about a landfall possibly late Saturday night or early Sunday morning in South Florida, that you're going to start to see the models they've already shrunk down in terms of the range. They're going to shrink even more. So we could take you through the afternoon NAM model, which I haven't really been paying too much attention to until the last day or two. It was well to the east yesterday, as a number of my followers on Facebook pointed out to me, and I was aware. And it came way west today. It kind of nudged a little bit to the east late this afternoon, but it has Irma coming on shore. This is at 5 a.m. Sunday into southeastern Florida, riding just inland of the coast. Probably on this track, it would go over Homestead, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Pompano, and then back out over the waters east, just offshore and just southeast of Jacksonville by the time we get to 2 a.m. Monday. Probably at this point, it would be a category, maybe a strong 2 or a weak 3. It's hard to say.
Right.
That circulation, a vast chunk of that eye wall stays, the eastern quadrant stays over water or just barely
Right.
inland.
Right.
So, you're not going to lose, this thing's not going to lose intensity very long. Again, this looks like it kind of shifted maybe toward the eastern end of that envelope, but it's very, very close.
Yeah, and the fact that we're seeing, as you just pointed out, that all the models seem now to be targeting or showing a relatively narrow channel now for the storm to move up. We're now talking about, what are we talking about? We're talking about a matter of just a few miles, whether it's either on the coast or just east of the east inland, or east over the ocean, or westward just inland. The fact is that we have a great handle as to exactly where this thing is going to go several days in advance. I think back, 20, 30 years, we didn't have this type of ability.
I was thinking today, I was trying to imagine back at that time in terms of dealing with something like this, and without having all we only had 2 models, maybe 3.
Right.
Even the Hurricane Center maybe only had a couple extra models or 2, and we never got to see those at all.
Right.
They only got to see them.
Right.
I wonder how they did it. To tell you the truth, I don't know. How they did it.
The guys back in the 60s and 70s, I got the impression, had been into specifically tropical analysis and weather, hurricanes and tropical systems for a good number of years, and so a lot of what they forecast was also just simply gut feelings. That, the empiricism.
And we do that too a lot.
Yeah.
So
we think back and said, "Hey, this looks like the storm of whatever."
Here's the GFS, on a late afternoon GFS, and you can see that the track is fairly similar. With the GFS, I'm able to give them the more the western Atlantic view, so we can see the areas further south. And you can see that the hurricane just kind of skims the north coast of Cuba. The pressures are down in the low 19s and 9 single digits, which is certainly a Category 5. Brings it onshore. Looks like it would be just over or just west of Miami and Fort Lauderdale. Same idea. And then inland, back either into northeastern Florida near Jacksonville after a brief visit over the water, or probably near Savannah. And by the way, at this point, we can probably again say what we were saying yesterday. This is not coming here.
No.
It is not coming up the coast. The impact here is going to be minimal, particularly because of the fact that it goes northwest towards central Tennessee. I mean, it's practically the remnant low goes to Memphis.
Right.
Okay. The other thing we want to look at too, by the way, and this is equally dire for a different reason, I believe. Okay, I don't think we want to see that. I just saw something. I just saw something I don't want to see. Okay. All right. This is tropical Hurricane Jose, which is now a major hurricane, Category 3, approaching the Northern Leeward Islands. And hurricane watches are up for some of the Northern Leeward Islands, and this is really an almost unfathomable situation. You can't even write. I couldn't even have imagined to write this as a plot.
Right.
But here you have a region that has just been buzzsawed by a Category 5 hurricane. You have islands that the reports we're seeing coming back, and some of the pictures of the absolute utter devastation. These islands were just leveled. Some of these islands have no communication whatsoever, which means it's entirely possible that these people don't even know that there is another Category 3 hurricane headed close to them. I mean, this is really, it's very frightening, and it's bizarre and frightening. At least the models seem to be just barely skimming that north coast. I mean, enough to give them a bit of a scare. But if we get one of these southward shifts that we've been seeing, we're facing what could be a pretty dire situation for those people in the northern leewards. I'm going to go, Joe, one second. I just want to, I'm going to switch to the tight southeast view. This way I don't accidentally do what I just did. But here's by the way, this map here shows the GFS forecast wind field. So the purplish area, actually, when you get into the darker purples and the areas in here, this is where you see the hurricane force winds. And that black area, that's the core. So that's probably where you're talking about winds over 100, 100 knots or sustained winds of 100 knots or more. And you can see on the GFS's track that those hurricane force winds really spread very far inland.
Right.
And this is one of the things about the fact that if you wind up with something that moves along or west of I-95, you're going to have hurricane force winds on both coasts, and you're going to have hurricane force winds, or certainly hurricane force gusts in many inland areas, right, aside from all the other issues. But you can see how the wind field then on this track impacts coastal Georgia and coastal South Carolina. And folks have been asking about the Outer Banks. You're going to be on the northern fringe of this. So honestly, I mean, I went through a tropical storm there a few years ago, Tropical Storm Gustav, that I slept through with 70-mile-an-hour winds. You're not going to get that. You might get some gales up there, but in fact, if the sustained gales make it up on this offshore, at least just north of Wilmington, but up a little further north over the Outer Banks. I mean, maybe you might get a little bit of fringe rain in the north, but it's not going to be anything. The center's not anywhere near close to you, so I wouldn't really worry too much.
Well, it's kind of like we heard of nor'easter. That will be a sou'easter for them.
Yes, correct.
So.
Correct.
Yeah.
All right, so let's.
And by the way, you jumped accidentally with Jose,
right,
showing you, and the fact is, and we were stressing this from late last week. So many people, and I heard from one guy in particular on Saturday. He sent me a message on Facebook saying, "Go with the European. The European is sending it out to sea," and he was talking about something that was over a week away. And we've been saying this now over and over again. Once you get beyond 5 days, a lot of these models, even the best global models, even the king, as some call the European, will get it wrong. And you just don't do that. You just don't go beyond 5 days, especially with these tropical systems, and trying to anticipate what is going to happen. Now, here we have the latest recon.
Right. It looks like the plane is now, it's up at 22 degrees north, so it's flying inbound. So it's coming in from the northeast. It's still a good 120 miles away,
right,
because it has to get down near 20.
I don't want to give the people the impression that somebody just shot it down and it's going
right. No. Now we're this is at flight level, which is not that far off sea level, but you'll notice that even though the hurricane is well over 100 miles north of the center, there are 50 to 60, 55 knot winds now that have been measured, and gales would be in the darker green barbs, and they go all the way up almost 150, 180 miles north of the center. So we have a very wide area of gales with this. We have a rather wide area of storm force winds before we get to the hurricane force winds. So this is I'll be very curious to see what kind of pressure it finds when it gets there, because the structure of the storm really has not changed very much, and the Hurricane Center had commented on the fact that the structure of this storm has been remarkably solid over the last couple of days.
Yeah, and I'm already thinking ahead, Joe, to beyond Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, because Tuesday and Wednesday likely the sun is going to come back out in Florida, but a lot of people are going to be without access to air conditioning and water. And let me tell you something. If you've ever spent time in August or September down in Florida at this time of the year, if you can't stand humidity or even moderate levels of heat, it's going to be tough to deal with for those people who are without electricity or without the access to even just a simple fan. And you're going to see people, who are going to be suffering for a number of days after this thing goes by. So I just, it's going to be terrible to see, but this is what they're all going to be facing after Irma goes by Sunday and Monday.
Let me just, say as we kind of start to wrap this up a little bit, over the years, I've never, I've never been. I tell my followers a lot, when they ask me about storms, if they're worried, because they're worried, and I tell them, if I'm not worried, you shouldn't be worried. Okay.
Right.
There have only been a handful of times where I've gotten concerned, and only maybe a couple of times really where I was very concerned. One of them was with Hurricane Sandy, and the other. It was with the Snowmageddon storm on Long Island, but that was something that was very local to me, where I wound up with almost 3 feet of snow in 12 hours time and watched it snow like it was in a snow globe.
Right.
But this, I think, is one of those times where, look, I am really hoping, and I want to make this really clear, and I think Joe would agree with me, and he's hoping too, that it passes out, that the core of the hurricane stays offshore and doesn't make a landfall in Florida. We're hoping that it, weakens. Maybe it'll weaken to a strong Category 3 or something. Something at least that is not as destructive as a 4 or certainly a 5 would be. We're not sitting here rooting for this. It's a marvel for us to look at this from a meteorological standpoint. But, this is one of those times where, if I were in South Florida and I lived, if I was in Southeast Florida along the coast, I would get out. I wouldn't dice roll a 20 or 30 mile shift in a track and stay. I mean, that's my opinion.
Right.
That's just speaking for myself. Folks, you need to be in consultation with their local officials regarding recommendations of what they should or shouldn't do, because those people know the geography and the areas you live in. I don't. If you happen to be watching this from Florida right now, or particularly Southeast Florida, so you need to, rely on them for information. And you know what? If it doesn't happen, we should be thankful. We've seen the destruction from Harvey. We saw the destruction that just happened in the Leeward Islands. And I'm sure we're going to be seeing what's happening in the Bahamas over the next 24 hours. We want this to go away.
Yeah.
Okay? We want this to go away. So let's hope that, something changes in the meteorological arena that causes things to maybe go a little further east. Or I don't want to say if it goes further west and part of it winds up going into the north coast of Cuba, but then that affects the people in the north coast of Cuba. We don't want to do that. We just want this to just kind of find a way to thread a needle and go out. But right now, from what we're looking at, that's not going to happen, and it's a very serious situation.
Yes. In fact, you mentioned, I said yesterday on my Facebook page, a discussion, I said, I honestly hope that this forecast that I'm about to give to all of you is flat out wrong. I
echo that, by the way.
And it's, why, you always want me to be wrong?
No. I want to be wrong with you, Joe.
Yes. I can empathize. In 1966, my mom, my sister, and I, we went to Puerto Rico. We were in San Juan. It was late August, and a hurricane by the name of Fate. And you can look this up probably on the internet. I'm sure you can find it on some site or whatever like that. They give the tracks and paths. And for the longest time, this thing looked like it was headed straight for Puerto Rico. And to be on the island of Puerto Rico and see everybody literally in terror that this giant storm was going to come. And what happened? The storm at the last minute seemed to veered out to the north. Thank God. Everybody took a big sigh of relief. I kind of wonder now, back then they didn't have what we have, the ability of knowing that. But we
certainly don't seem to have a model right now that's pointing to an out-to-sea solution.
Well, I remember the next day on television they had one of the priests from one of the churches say, we all gathered here in the church and we prayed the storm away. And maybe if the power of prayer does indeed work, I would hope that all of you, especially if you have relatives or family or loved ones in Florida, do a little bit of praying, because that's what they're going to need every bit of. Hopefully to turn that storm out and away from the track that we're thinking of right now.
I've had a number of my friends were messaging me about the fact that they've got their mom living in Florida in a coastal location, or their parents or some relative.
I mentioned this yesterday. Miami is sometimes referred to as the sixth borough.
Yes, all of Florida. I think everyone here in the New York area in New Jersey and Long Island and Hudson Valley knows somebody that lives in Florida. They know many people that live in Florida. I certainly do. Or we have relatives that live in Florida. So we have this connection from that respect. And a lot of my friends that messaged me saying that they have an elderly parent there who refuses to leave, does not want to go.
Right.
I don't know how much arm twisting you can do, and I suppose if to forcibly make them go, encourage them to seek shelter, because if they're in a really vulnerable location along the coast, there's going to be a problem. There's a storm surge inundation tool on the National Hurricane Center's website. I'll put it up on my page, and it allows you to go to whatever specific geographic point, and you can see in your neighborhood, in your particular neighborhood, how deep, not how high the storm surge will be, but how deep will the water be given the storm surge that's forecast. So I noticed that from the storm surges that are being forecast using this inundation tool, that there would be a foot of water or more well inland. Right. I mean, not just, a couple of blocks, but I'm talking from the coast, but well inland by several miles. So I'll put that link up if you need, it might be useful as a way of convincing someone that it might be wise to go. I have no idea how this is going to turn out. Joe doesn't have any idea how this is going to turn out. None of us do. So you can only go by what we have in terms of information. Like I said, I don't get worried too often about this sort of stuff.
And this is long distance. But
yeah, we're long distance.
But, it's not happening here, but we're still very concerned. And, so I'm getting tired of this now. People think that we're in the business and we get excited when something like this happens or when there's a massive storm on the way. Let me assure all of you that in such cases as this, all right, this kind of drew the two of us into the science of meteorology.
Until we realized that we actually have to work doing this in order to get paid.
Admittedly, we were when we teenagers or in our early 20s or whatever,
young kids, we don't know. Kids,
we didn't have a mortgage to pay.
Right.
We were not married. We didn't have kids. We didn't have the responsibilities. But now, all these years later, we empathize with all of you. We know that all of you are going to be going through hard times down in Florida or whenever we have a big storm up here. And it's not like, oh boy, we're going to have a big storm. Aren't you excited? No, we're not. We want it to go away. We want it to go.
Okay. We want Jose to go away.
Yeah. Prepare for the worst and hope for the best. What else can I possibly say?
All right. So, we're going to keep everybody updated. Joe's got his Facebook page, so you can catch his latest information there. That's Joe Rayo.
Oh, Joe Rayo Weather on Facebook.
Right, and of course you're already on mine if you're watching, and you're on his if you're watching from his page. So,
let me just quickly mention something that is actually good. It's natural and it's also good. There was another type of storm on the sun yesterday. There was a massive solar flare. And while I can't make any promises, nobody really can, because the science of solar weather or space weather is still somewhat uncertain. There's the possibility that tomorrow night, in our latitude, here in the New York metropolitan area, and especially points north, we may have a view of the northern lights tomorrow night. And the skies are expected to become clear tomorrow night. So we have a chance. I'll mention this tomorrow more on my Facebook page. Right now, we're, again, more concerned with Irma. But something to take your mind off of the potential disaster that is coming over the weekend is a nice little maybe light show or celestial sky show tomorrow night in our sky due to an explosion on the sun, a major solar storm. Again, we'll talk more about that probably tomorrow.
Anthony, what did you want to photobomb my live shot? Anthony's on audio. So Anthony waves goodbye, so we'll wave goodbye. We'll try and do this around the same time tomorrow night at 7:30. Thanks for being here. And
tell your friends.
Yes, please. And if you are in Florida right now, be safe. Do everything you have to do to secure yourself and your families. And if you're in South Carolina and coastal South Carolina and Georgia, don't pay attention, because it's eventually going to head up your way in some form along about Monday into Monday night. So we'll keep you updated on everything. Have a great night, and we will see you tomorrow. Good night.
Good night.
Okay, folks, I'm back. I taped that with Joe Rayo, RAO, and Joe Rayo Weather is his Facebook page. If you want to take a look at that, we taped that together about 2 hours ago, and then after I was done taping it, I got in the car and drove home, and was able, you guys got to see it now. While we're together, we can take a look at the weather models, the new weather models. So I'm going to show you what's going on with that. So let's I'll pull that up for you, and we will let it load. We'll interact with it, and I'll put the tropical. We'll start with the NAM, because the NAM did something really it was just strange. I honestly didn't even know what to make of it, to tell you the truth. And a few of you did mention the NAM model on this. So let's end the mystery and show you what's happening. Thank you, by the way, for those of you who hit the super chat tonight. I really appreciate it. Joe and I will split a cup of coffees with it. Thank you so much. So take a look at, now why is this the way it is? Hold on. This is odd. Oh, I have the wrong one. I have the wrong version of the NAM. So let's get to the correct one. So you can see the very bottom of the hurricane here. I'm sorry, the very top of the hurricane at the bottom of the picture. And what the NAM wound up doing was it moved it, kind of consistent up at this point. It's a little further north. It makes the turn much sooner, and then begins to move it northeastward, and actually brings it over eastern North Carolina and tries to bring it up the coast. I have to tell you, I really thought that this was just made absolutely no sense to me as to why it would do that. The upper air on the NAM, for whatever reason, decides what it's doing is it's taking this trough that's up in New England and stretching it southward. Okay, and if you watch, that trough in New England basically picks this up and brings it up the East Coast. I just don't think that that's real. Okay, if we look at the GFS, and we have to think that the global GFS models and all the global models are going to handle this totally differently. And you can see on the GFS, it's just going to take a little time to load because traffic on tropical tidbits remains very heavy through all of this. The GFS does nothing like that. It just it does what it's been doing, which is basically kick the trough out to the east. And that really makes the most sense here. For it to stretch out and cut off, I'm not saying that it's impossible. I suppose there's the possibility that the NAM's onto something, but for the NAM to do that and the GFS not to have it at all is, to me, telling me that the NAM is just getting it wrong. And it wouldn't be the first time that it would have done something like this. I have to tell you, if the NAM winds up being right and this thing were to fly up the East Coast like that, I would be absolutely stunned over that development. And believe it or not, I actually had to look at the Canadian model to try to gain some support for the idea of the NAM or the GFS. And if you look at the Canadian, it's the same as the GFS. That trough just does not do what the GFS does. It just gets kicked out, and the hurricane goes into eastern Florida, and then eventually up into the southeast, and then finds its way to spend itself out in the west central Appalachians. We'll go now to the. Oh, good. Nobody's complaining about audio, so that's good. That means I still have you. Okay, so we'll go to the surface map on the GFS, and I'm going to take the. I'm going to take the southeast region, okay, because this way it'll put us up real close to everything. And we'll let me start with the 12 hours, so you can see the top of the hurricane. Here's Cuba, Florida. You see Florida, and as we move it along, there's the GFS with it. And what the GFS does is it brings it probably right over the westernmost key, and then just takes it up just along I-95, really, all the way up. It really is not that much different than its prior run. It's maybe a shade further east, but it takes the hurricane inland right there. You can see it there right on the westernmost key of the Florida Keys, and then just rides it right up I-95 over Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and then it brings it back out over the water briefly east of Jacksonville, and then on up into southwestern South Carolina before it lifts it up northwestward. Now, some of you were asking about North Carolina. You are going to get into some rain out of this. The strongest winds are going to be to your south. You can see the low just kind of pivots back into the mountains, and then the rain just gets pushed up to the northeast. A little bit of a secondary low tries to form there later on next week. But you know what? I'm going to deal with that when we get to it, because it's way too much for me to have to pick apart. I'm really just trying to get a complete handle on the track, because the landfall question is huge, and if we if it starts shifting in one direction or another, we want to be on top of it. This was the Canadian, by the way. I'm sorry, I knew it looked a little strange to me. This was the Canadian, the Canadian's run, which brings the rain, and the hurricane a little bit further north on a second landfall in South Carolina. Now we'll go back to the GFS. There's so much to look at. It's very easy to get confused with all this. See, the GFS brings it over that westernmost key, and then pretty much rides it right up the Florida coastline, all the way up to Jacksonville. And at this point, by the way, it still has a pressure of 940, which would be a strong Category 3 hurricane. The GFS pushes some rain into North Carolina, but the yellow and the reds and the purples, that's where the real big rain is. And most of that goes northwestward up into the Appalachians. You can look at the rainfall totals that the model generates, so we can get a flavor of it. And you can see it actually doesn't produce a whole ton of rain. I mean, it does produce heavy rains along the path of the hurricane. It's been very consistent with this. But because we don't have a really strong upper air system, we have an upper air system there, but we don't have a really strong one. It is not generating the big kinds of rain you might expect to see with a hurricane that goes northwestward into the mountains. I'm sure there will be some, but there are some 3, 4, 5 inch amounts, but we're not seeing 15 or 20 inches from what this model is indicating. So again, the critical point here is going to be where it makes that turn. I kind of can't wait for the day when the traffic on tropical tidbits starts to diminish again. But you can, again, there's the path out. I'll put the 10-meter wind, and you can see the wind field, so you can get an idea of what the GFS is doing with respect to wind. Now, all the dark here, this is the core of the hurricane. Okay, that really dark, almost black color, and that's circular area around the center. So I think we can just assume that all the wind in that black colored area is probably 100 knots or more, and that carries along to a large degree up the coast. Starts to shrink a bit because the hurricane is beginning to weaken, and then just about disappears once we get up toward Jacksonville, but we're still getting winds every bit sustained of up to 90 knots or more in some places. And then inland it goes west of Savannah, actually comes over Jacksonville on the GFS, and then moves on to the northwest. Why don't we also, at this point, I want to take a look at Hurricane Jose. Joyce Mack, thank you so much for hitting the super chat. I really appreciate it. That's another couple of cups of coffee. And Danielle Dean, thank you very much too Appreciate it greatly. You're all very generous. Thank you. Let's look at Jose, because Jose, the scary thing with me about to me about this is the fact that you've got a Category 3 major hurricane that may pass very close to the Leeward Islands, and after the fact that they've been just raked by this Category 5 hurricane that leaving those islands, many of those islands, with no communication ability at all. It really is unfathomable at this day and age that you would think that whole populations may be so cut off from communications they might not even know that there's a hurricane out there. Jose formed so quickly, they may have no information at all that there's another hurricane out there, and it gets very close to the northern leewards. They have hurricane watches up for many of those islands now, I mean, I couldn't even write a script like this. It would never have occurred to me that this would have been something that was possible. But watch what happens with Jose, because it's kind of caught in the overall broad circulation of Irma. It's on the periphery of it, so it winds up getting pulled northward, and it also should weaken, by the way, because it's passing over water that Irma just went through. That water has been upwelled, and we're going to look at the water temperatures there in just a second. But once Irma moves inland north and west like this, it sort of breaks its hold on Jose, and that allows it to try to move eastward. But the problem is that the steering flow out in this part of the Atlantic, with the way the upper air is set up, is going to get very weak. And it's likely to meander there for a couple of days and maybe do some kind of a loop. And you can see the model does do that. Ultimately, it actually tries to take it northward and then take it northeastward. And by the way, then something else appears here late in the forecast period, but that also gets pulled up as an ocean storm. At least that is the solution on this particular run. I'm just going to suggest that maybe, given what we've been going through, it might not be a bad idea to just not throw any kind of solution with regards to Jose off the table. But first and foremost, it needs to miss the Leeward Islands and leave them alone. Now, we'll look at the water temperature map. I'm going to see if I can get the last ones from 9/6. So let's see if there's been any appreciable cooling. Well, we don't have the data from 9/7. I think after we look at the data from today, yesterday, September 7th, we're likely to see that the water might have cooled a bit near the Leeward Islands. It really, when you look at this, it didn't really cool all that much in the area where Irma passed back over at about 45 west. It looks like that's all 28 degrees C or higher. It may have cooled by a degree or so, but I would have expected it might have cooled by a bit more, but apparently that's not the case. And sometimes, that far out in the Atlantic is a great equalizer. The water temperature is so uniform, and the depth of the warm water goes pretty far down. Upwelling may not have as big an impact as it would, say, in the Gulf of Mexico or along the immediate Atlantic coast, or just offshore the Atlantic coast, where the depth of the warm water doesn't go as far down below the surface. So I'll be curious to see. There are a couple of pockets you see here of slightly cooler water, but it's not overly so. So there might be enough juice in this warm water temperature to keep Jose in fairly strong shape for a little while. The other thing that will eventually happen, and I'll show you on the tropical satellite, we'll look at the water vapor imagery here. Eventually, as Irma gets close to Florida, there's going to be a northerly flow. You see how these high clouds are moving from north to south on the periphery? So there might be some shear that will start to get involved when Irma starts to move further north, that will impact Jose to some degree. So that's something we're going to have to take a look at. By the way, Katia, also a hurricane, sitting. It hasn't moved all day long. It's been sitting in the southwest Gulf, just churning and churning away. It's small, but it is there. There's a tight little center that is evident when we look on the Atlantic satellite view. You can see it here. It actually has developed an eye, so it may have strengthened a little bit, but it's more than it is going to be going to the southwest into Mexico, probably during the day tomorrow or tomorrow night. And of course, Irma just continues to bowl along as if it has no concerns about what paths are ahead of it. It's just going through them all and taking them out. I'll get a recent tight picture here of Irma, and you can see the eye. You know, it's there's some interaction going on with Hispaniola. There doesn't seem to be much interaction yet going on with Cuba. We still have that rather circular look to it, very symmetrical, the eye very well defined. And look how it went over these the eye went over these very two small islands that are just south of the main islands in Turks and Caicos, and it threaded the needle, and the eye is now going over this tiny island right there. I'm not familiar with the name of it. And on its current track, it's going to probably pass by most of these islands, and I believe this might be Grand Bahama. I'm not 100% sure, but the eye may come very close to this particular island. So one of the keys to the strength going forward is going to be the interaction of the circulation with the eastern half of Cuba, which tends to be mountainous. The western half of Cuba tends to be flat. And when we go further northwest, you start to see here's southeast Florida, here are the Florida Keys. So Irma's supposed to wind up making a landfall somewhere at the easternmost key, right there. I think I said westernmost key. I meant the easternmost earlier. I meant the easternmost key. You do this all day long, folks, and sometimes east and west start looking the same, and it all gets very confusing. So I'm just going to real quick, because we're coming on a full hour here, which is awesome. I seem to have lost everybody's chat. I hope I didn't lose the stream here. Oh, there we go. I just had to click on it. Sorry. The eye is about 25 miles wide. Yeah, on the big shot, it looks very small, but when you look at that tight shot, it really looks, it is a rather sizable eye. Let's see. I'm just trying to scroll through some of you. By the way, some of you have really came up with some very good questions tonight, and that's great. There's no power or communications at all in Antigua. That's just horrible. It boggles my mind that there are people that they're not going to know that this has happened. Rockin' Steve B, thank you very much for hitting the super chat tonight. I really appreciate it. Recon pressure down 924. Thank you, Anthony. I saw a 919, so I guess maybe the next one's 924. Connor Lynch, do I think Irma's maxed out strength? You know what? It might have. I mean, this thing's been a Category 5 now for almost 48 hours. That's unusually long for a storm to maintain this kind of intensity. It would not be at all a surprise if the intensity were to come down a bit. But, depending on how it moves when it gets into the Florida Straits, the Florida Straits have produced Category 5, has a history of producing a Category 5 hurricane with the Labor Day Key storm back in the 1930s. So even though that was all a very small hurricane in terms of the actual geographic size, the GFS wants to strengthen it again in that area. I don't see it. There's no wind shear issues. The water temperatures are 30 degrees Celsius or higher. So it's a question of how much interaction maybe with the mountains of eastern Cuba that disrupt the circulation. I think that would be the one inhibiting factor that would keep this from strengthening above the peak strength that it hit, which was 185 miles an hour on the wind and a pressure of 914 millibars. And Irma's retired. That name will never be used again. That happened the minute it became a Category 5 and the minute it went through the Leeward Islands. Let's see. Why does the GFS handle the pressure numbers so poorly? Actually, Brian Locke, the GFS of all the models through all of this, the GFS has actually been the best with the pressure. The European has not done well on the initialization pressure. It kind of caught up a little bit, but the GFS has handled the pressure on this much better. I'm not sure why it's like that. You know, there was a time when these models, when they were more primitive, were always bad with the pressure with tropical systems, and I mean really bad. You know, you'd have a Category 3 hurricane with a 950 pressure, and it would show you a 1,000 millibar low. So, and it wasn't that they were necessarily bad. It's just that the technology at the time, the sophistication of the models at the time, the amount of data going into it, and so on, was far less than what it is now. So you got poor results. The grids on those on the older models were spacing was much wider, and what I mean by that is, you know, data points were, you know, if you look at a grid, you look at a grid, so you get data from each point in the grid. Well, on some of the older models, the grids were, you know, 60 miles apart, even more. You know, now you've got models that have grids where you're getting data for every 3 kilometers squared. So you're getting a lot of data in those in the models now, much more concentrated. Then you have all this satellite data that goes into it, and you know, now with the Air Force, with the Air Force reconnaissance aircraft, you're getting data from all these hurricanes, the 3 of them that are out there producing data. So all of that data is coming in here. Sometimes, you know, I wonder if there could be too much information with some of these, with all this data coming in, that oftentimes you get models that seem to be, you know, distorted, you know, with some of their outcomes. By the way, the recon that's in Katya has a pressure of 983, 984. So that pressure has dropped, you know, has dropped a bit from where it was yesterday, and I'm seeing some winds on the order of 64 to 83 knots. So it's probably pretty consistent with what the advisory showed. We have the last mission from Irma. The pressures that were measured were 920, 921, 919, and then a 5 millibar jump to 924. So seems like we're getting this sort of, you know, very unsteady weakening slowly, but it might be, we have to be careful. It might be it may very well be an eye wall replacement cycle that's underway. There hasn't been one of those in a while. This thing has held its own, you know, pretty. The intensity has been so steady for so long. You know, there might be an eye wall replacement cycle that's underway. In which case, we're going to get a little bit of fluctuation in strength. And then once that cycle is done, we might get another burst of intensification. I don't know. We don't have an Air Force mission into Jose. They got the 2 planes out, the NOAA plane and the Air Force Recon plane, so they may not have a third one to send out, at least not at the moment. So, you know, they're doing everything on that based on satellite estimates. You know, it would be nice if they could have a little data from that, because of the fact that the threat that's there to the Leeward Islands. I'll take a couple of your more questions, folks, and then I gotta go to sleep. Let's see. James Talley, you know, let me just explain something. You have all this information in the world in our hands with smartphones, thousands of satellites watching everything, and the best they can do is maybe it's going this way or that. I don't understand that. If you could just tell me, what do you expect? I cannot give you, you know, you're never going to get certitude when it comes to a science where every single molecule of the atmosphere is changing every single moment of every nanosecond. Okay. You can't, all the technology in the world that we have right now cannot get ahead of that. I just don't understand that attitude. I don't. You're not entitled to certitude. If you think that you are, I mean, I can't give it to you, and there's no meteorologist that can. It just doesn't work that way. It's never worked that way. Now, you might be saying that in terms of frustration, and I can understand that because, sometimes I think with all this stuff that we have and all this data and all these models, well, it's mathematical equations that come out with answers, and it all depends on what the data that you put into it. And some models look at things a certain way, and some models look at things another way. I wish I could look. If it was certitude, it'd be easy. You wouldn't need me to do this. You could just punch it up on a computer, and maybe someday, many decades into the future, because it's not going to happen in my lifetime, I don't think. You might have the science down to a point where there is a certain degree of certitude that you won't really need a person to interpret it. You'll just be able to punch it up on your device or on whatever they're going to be using 20 or 30 years from now, and take whatever information you'd like. But it's just very frustrating for me, for what I do professionally, to hear that from somebody, because it's not like we're making this stuff up. I mean, we're trying our best and using our expertise that we've kind of crafted over so many years. Then to have somebody say that we're not doing the best job that we can is a tough thing to hear. Okay, I don't mean to be disrespectful. I don't think you were meaning to be disrespectful. I sometimes, when I see that, because I get all the usual jokes and all the usual things that people, kid me about. But in the last couple of years, I used to just let it go. But in the last couple of years, I've gotten a little, and particularly in the last year or two, maybe it's because I'm getting older, and I'm going to be 59 in January, and I've been doing this for all my life. I've gotten really sensitive to it. I do, I try to do a very good job. And, it's hard to hear it when somebody makes fun of your profession. So I just kind of get a little, I get my back up a little bit about it. And certainly, I would never, ever say to somebody, if I asked them what they did for a living, it'd be like if somebody said to me that they were a surgeon, and my response is, oh, so you basically butcher people up for your mortgage payment. It's like, oh, if I ever said that to someone who was a surgeon or a doctor, they'd probably, look at me and just have a very low opinion of me. So, I try to accept it as the joke it's supposed to be. But, when you're working hard and you're doing all this stuff that we have to do now with social media and I'm doing these YouTube streams, and I'm doing these. I'm not doing them for anybody else. These are mine. It just gets a little hard to hear. But listen, for a second I took it the wrong way, and then I took a breath. Okay, so I'm glad you're here, and at least it got a little bit of a change in the conversation. So listen, you guys are all great. I can't get over the audience that I have here on YouTube. I'm really just loving it. I know sometimes it takes a storm to bring everybody out, and I've been doing daily videos for quite a while now, and I was hoping that one day it would pay off in a bigger audience, and I'm glad it has. So yeah, I'm relaxed, Wayne. No worries. It gets a little punchy after it's at 1:10 in the morning. So listen, it's been a great hour and 10 minutes. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. Tomorrow is my Friday, so it's also my late day, so I don't have to rush out here at an hour earlier than normal, and that hour makes a difference. So we'll shoot for a live stream at noon. This way I'll have the new GFS, and I'm gonna, Anna, you let me put it up. Hang on. we'll have the new GFS up for that particular live stream, so we'll have all the latest model information, most of the beginnings of the latest model information. And we're now inside 60 hours from landfall, so I think what we're going to see is the models very, very, get very, very close together. The NAM model tonight aside, that just seems to be totally, off the wall. I just think that's a totally off the wall solution. And if the GFS had come in and done something like that, or had gone to, way to the east, I would have been, concerned in so many different directions. It would have been a way of breathing a sigh of relief for Florida, certainly, to avoid getting a direct hit. But the Canadian, the GFS came in the same. The Canadian and the GFS are very, very close. And I'm going to guess that the European is going to do what it's been doing, which is being a little bit to the left or to the west of the GFS and the Canadian. And the GFS is on the, let's say I'm going to stick with what I've been saying, which is the GFS's track would be as far to the right or as far as the east, to the east as you might see it. And the European would be as far to the left or to the west as you might see it, somewhere in between those two. And that's where all the hurricane tracking models were last night. In fact, I don't think I showed you the new ones, so we can see that. And here they are. So this was the look at the cluster in the hurricane tracking maps. They all take it into Florida at 0Z. So every single one of them, not a single one of them does not have a Florida landfall at this point. So that would say to me that the NAM, which is way out here, is just off the wall. And these model, if the hurricane track models had something out there, I would say okay, then maybe we have something that we need to look at. But as long as this look continues as we go through the day on. As we go through the day on Friday, I'm not going to really vary as far as my forecast is concerned. So everybody have a great, go to bed, and have a great Friday, and we'll see you tomorrow, probably around noontime. All right. Good.